everybody, it's Professor Parish again, and welcome to part 2 of this two-part discussion of our Discovering Literature Poetry unit. So, let me get this started on here. Alright, so in my part 1 video, I talked about chapters 12 through 15 in our Discovering Literature book, which was the first half of our poetry unit. And now I'm going to talk about the second half, which is chapters 16 through 22. So, like I said before, this book has a lot of example poems. Our discussion forums and our reading responses will require you to look through some of those poetry. But for today, for this discussion, we're just going to kind of go through terminology, talk about concepts, look through a few example poems in this presentation, and just kind of talk about poetry some more. All right? I feel like this class goes really fast, and especially the poetry unit, because there's so much to talk about and we just kind of have to go through the basics, I guess you could say. So we're going to start off with chapter 16, which is about symbolism. I love on page 739 the image they have that's of this cool tree. It looks like it's in the middle of a swamp with all of these roots coming down. And I love that because symbolism is all about, as we learned with fiction, things that have more than one meaning. And the roots kind of show that there's more beneath the surface than just what you see. And I think that's so cool. Because that's pretty much what symbolism is. It's all about what's beyond just the surface level meaning. And poetry uses symbolism so much. Our terms start out, we have allegory, which are a set of symbols that work together to create a pattern or an image in poetry. And that term itself kind of starts to take place in our textbook towards page 747. You can kind of get some nice poetry examples there with William Blake. But I want to go on further and talk about this glossy page section on page 762 is where the glossy pages start. I love the idea of symbolism being used and having more than one meanings, and you can see there with the allegory that places and colors, they can have double meanings. So if the color red is present throughout the poem, it can have more than one meaning. It may not just mean love, it could also mean, you know, relationships, it could mean passion, it could mean fury, it could have a fire, it could have a bunch of different meanings with it as well. On page 762, we start our second set of glossy pages, and I actually like this set probably the best out of all the glossy pages in our textbook, mainly because I think the symbolism is interesting, and the authors of the textbook do a really good job of finding poems and images that match in interesting ways and very well. So it starts with Nighthawks there. You can see Edward Hopper's famous painting, and I actually minored in art, so every time I see an artwork like this I get excited. So Edward Hopper's Nighthawks painting is pretty famous in the art world just because of how its use of color and light, but also the symbolism behind that painting. If you guys look at that picture there, you'll notice a few things, such as the darkness outside in the town and how the only light is coming from this one diner. And you also see there's these three people sitting there, and even though they're in close proximity, they're not talking to one another, they're just kind of sitting there in silence. And there's no exit to this restaurant other than the little back room there that's kind of closed off. And it's just very isolating and almost kind of creepy and solitary. And I think the poem that accompanies it at the bottom of the page does a nice job of kind of examining that setting and what it means. So I really like these glossy pages if you look through. I think the pictures are interesting choices and they go with the poems very well. Especially Frenzied Movement, Jackson Pollock's number 1 is a good one. The fire engine and figure number 5 is good. And then How Real Are Dreams, that one is good as well. So check out those poems and those combinations. You'll probably have some questions about those, so definitely give them a look. But that's pretty much it for chapter 16. I know chapter 14 and 16 do not have a lot of terms. They're mainly just about imagery, and looking at the poems and image combinations. But don't worry, Chapter 17 makes up for it. Chapter 17, which is aptly titled Words, the Web of Language, has quite a bit of terminology to go through. So on page 773, we start talking about words, and I like the picture that leads off this chapter too. It's of a word cluster, and I really like that. I think it's fitting. So right from the get-go, we're given some information about word usage in poetry, and this is kind of echoing what we talked about in the last presentation. But the idea is that there are these 4 things that poets look for and use when they're choosing the words of their poems. And the first thing they talk about is how poets are quote-unquote sticklers for the right word. We said that poetry is language at its best, meaning that if you're going to write good poetry, you've got to choose the exact word that you need for what you're trying to convey. And poets often, scour and search and write and rewrite and draft to get that poem to be exactly how they want it. And so that's a pretty important thing, to choose the right language to convey the messages you're wanting to. Poets have a keen ear for emotional quality of words. They understand denotation versus connotation, which we talked about in our prose unit. We talked about how connotation is the emotional meaning and denotation is the direct meaning. And authors and poets understand that, and so when they're choosing words, sometimes they may want a word that means something specifically, but also has that emotional weight as well. And poets have a keen ear for differences in tone. Tone is simply the attitude that words create. The way that a poem's use of words is shaped can change the way that we understand it as we read it. So if a poem is yelling, quote unquote at you with lots of exclamation points and harsh, attack verbs, then it may set off a different tone as to if it was just like a wandering, rambling poem with just, whimsical words and things like that. They have a different meaning and a different attitude they convey. I really like the term archaic in our book, which talks about basically language that is outdated. So, for example, when we read Shakespeare or we read a Old English or Middle English text and we see words like thou and thou shalt and words like that, thine, words we don't say anymore in our vocabulary because they're just outdated. The vernacular has just changed. And something I love about literature is the fact that our words constantly are being refigured and reevaluated to see their worth. So something like thine and thou and shout that were considered, mainstay words back in the 1600s, we don't even use them anymore. We see them and we go, oh, okay. And it's one of the reasons why Shakespeare is so hard to read for modern audiences, is because we don't talk like Shakespeare and we don't read like Shakespeare and his audiences would at the time. So I think it's really interesting to look back at poetry and how they use archaic language and see how that's changed. I think that's interesting. And then poets have a keen ear for the sounds of words. They understand words that have specific meaning. Oh, let me go back. So for example, these 3 terms, and I know one of them's kind of cut off, but if you download the presentation, you'll be able to see it. We have Dr. Rice at the college used to be my speech coach, and one of his favorite words was onomatopoeia, which is simply words that sound like they are spelled. And there are quite a few onomatopoetic words that exist. So for example, words like hush and buzz and hiss, a lot of animal sounds, and bark and stomp and slap. Words, they actually have that sound built into their spelling, which is so cool. And a lot of poets will use that to their advantage and choose those words because they not only convey a thought, but they also convey a sound when the readers see them on the page. Poetic diction is a more refined and elegant speech than normal conversation. It's kind of flowery, poetic language where we dictate and we enunciate and pronounce things very specifically, as opposed to just slang where you just kind of say it like it is, sort of thing. That's what diction is. And then circumlocution, I love that word as well. It is, and I know it's hard to see on this slide, a phrase that takes the long way around in its meaning. So for example, you could say, instead of my primary residence, a home or a house. Primary residence is a circumlocution. It's taking the long way around saying that it's just a home. When I did technical writing, we did resumes for it, and I had a student that I told my students when they write resumes, you can use language and phrase things in specific ways to make yourself sound very good. And I encouraged my students to do that because it's not lying, it's being creative, and it's making yourself look the best that you can. And I had a student that said he was an Italian, on his resume he put down, and I loved it, Italian cuisine preparer and transporter. He was a pizza delivery guy. He delivered pizza for Domino's, but he had Italian cuisine preparer and transporter, and I loved it. I was like, that's great. And that's what circumlocution is. It's just finding an elegant way of saying something very simple. Because if you're reading a poem, you may want to read primary residence more than just, oh, my house. So it's just a different way of saying it, but I love those terms. More terms, we have dialects, which are the way that poets can tell people the setting of their poem. So on page 795, for example, we have Hugh MacDiarmid's Weep and Wail No More. And I'm going to kind of read this to you all. You guys can see this on page 795. It's towards the bottom of the page. But it's just 2 verses. Weep and Wail No More, written in 1948. Stop killin' the deed. Gear our, you're weepin' and wailin'. You maun keep quiet, if you want to hear them still, and no blur their image in your mind. For they've only a faint wee whisperin' voice, makin' nae mair noise ava, than the growin' of the grass that flourishes where nobody walks. I wanted to say this in an Irish accent so bad because of the dialect. Those words, stop killin' the deed, gear our, you're weepin' and wailin'. You maun keep quiet. And even in that second verse there it says, making nae mair noise ava, making no more noise ever, is what that's really saying. But it's pronounced, making nae mair noise ava, than the growing of the grass that flourishes where naebody walks. And now that I'm reading it again, my dialect changes again. But just the way that they write it is trying to give you a sense of where that person talks. So, for example, if you say y'all in your poem, the poem probably doesn't take place in New Jersey. Probably not. But if you, I've read some poems where poets, they say like ka and keys. They say like ka, like K-A or C-A-H-R, and it's trying to get that like Boston accent, like ya ka K's. Like sort of like JFK sort of thing. But that's what dialect does. It is a way that poets can kind of create a sense of setting and time and place in their poetry. And then the other term is alliteration, which is my favorite poetry term ever. I love alliteration. It is the repetition of the same sound at the beginning of several words in the same line. So a little bit of alliteration there, even in its definition. Alliteration is a great thing to use if you're trying to find a title for your story or your paper and you're like, I don't know what to call this. Just use alliteration. If you're writing a paper about alligators, you could say like the allegory of alligators, awesomeness, anonymous. That's an alliteration. Or Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. That's alliteration. Just the same sounds of the words, the same starting sounds, repeated over and over. That is alliteration. And I love it. I highly recommend using it in your paper. That's chapter 17. Lots of terms there. The same goes with chapter 18, which is on form, which is where we revisit rhyme, meter, and stanza. And we kind of get more terms to go along with that. So we're looking up chapter 18. We start off on page 805 and go from there. And I kind of jump around a little bit with our terminology in this chapter. In rhyme is what we typically think of when we see rhyming in poetry. it's usually the normal rhyme scheme. The end word in the line rhymes. We also see the term internal rhyme, which is a little bit less common, and that's when rhymes are within the lines of a poem. So on page 811, for example, let me just turn back and forth here. Page 811 has all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil. That's all one line, but seared, bleared, and smeared are in the same line and they all rhyme. So that would be an internal rhyme. Page 807 reviews meter and stanza, so it kind of gives you again some different examples to look at there. We also have these terms on page 809, which are closed couplets and multiple rhymes. Closed couplets are pretty easy. It's just 2 lines of self-containing rhymes. So, for example, if you have your pattern, we talked about pattern in the last chapter, or in the last presentation, but if you have an A-A-B-B pattern, those are closed couplets. So if I said, all things end around the bend, up comes the sun, day has begun. So sun begun and then end and bend are your closed couplets. They're just 2 lines back to back that rhyme, that have ending rhymes at the end. Pretty simple. Multiple rhymes, you guys will have a question on your exam about multiple rhymes. That is where more than 2 lines rhyme. And in our textbook, they actually go on page 811 to talk about single, double, and triple rhymes. And I will be asking you guys for examples of single, double, and triple rhymes. So just keep that in mind. Single rhymes are easy. It's just 1 syllable. So moon soon, easy. Double rhymes are 2 syllables that the ending rhymes. So balloon, saloon, those are a double rhyme. And then a triple rhyme is 3 syllables. So extrovert, introvert. Those are your triple rhymes. So as long as you have some examples there for your exam, you should be fine. But I will ask you to define multiple rhymes and to give me an example of each of these. All right. Some more terminology with chapter 18. Assonance is similar to half and slant rhymes. It's more of kind of a distant echo. You're really grasping for straws if you're using assonance in your poetry. So for example, break and fade have a very hard A sound. And then mice and fight have a very hard I sound. So those would be uses of assonance. But again, it's not quite rhyming, and it's just it's kind of a grasping straws term in terms of your style. Anapest is when a foot in a meter has no stressed syllables. And then like usually if something's iambic, the stress is on the second syllable of a foot. But in anapest, there's no stress. And usually it's just read like you would read a piece of prose with no poetic quality. Trochaic is the opposite of iambic. Trochaic is when stress is on the first syllable of a foot. Iambic is on the second syllable of a foot. And that's really the only difference. I think trochaic sounds a little weird when you read it because I'm so used to naturally wanting to stress the second syllable. I'm pretty used to iambic when I read, that trochaic I'm like, this is kind of weird. But people do it. People write good poetry and use trochaic stressing, so I guess it works. All right, more terminology for chapter 18. I told you we'd make up for that here. These terms that are on here, the top 3, dactyl and blank verse. Dactyl, there are more terminology on that page with these, but you don't have to memorize all of them for the final, but I do just want to kind of go over them. So on page 818 to 819, there's all these things about tetrameter and trimeter, and you don't have to know those. It's just numbers of feet in a line. Pentameter, for example, we think of iambic pentameter. That term is thrown around all the time in poetry. Iambic pentameter would be a 5 stressed syllables on a line, and the second syllable of each foot is stressed, except the last one because it'd be like 2, 2, 1. So That's pentameter, 5 stressed syllables to a line of poetry. Blank verse is when there's no rhyming in a sonnet. It happens. And then dactyl is when there's 2 unstressed syllables and then a stressed one. So if you had a dactyl pentameter, you would have 2 stressed syllables, an unstressed syllable, and then 2 stressed syllables. Again, these are all stylistic terms. I want you guys to kind of look at these terms on page 818 and 819, because if you decide to analyze a poem for your paper number 2, then you will need to use these terms in your paper to kind of explain your reasoning. And I want you to be aware of what those terms mean. All right. Villanelle is just a country or folk song or poem. It's just that specific genre. Instead of calling it a country or folk poem, they call it a villanelle. It's just their way of saying it. And then I tried to come up with some examples to differentiate popular ballads from literary ballads. A popular ballad is a song-like poem that is longer than a lyric. So most of your songs on the radio are 2 to 3 minutes long. Those are lyrics. They're fairly short poems. A song like Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin that's, 9 to 11 minutes in length, that would be a popular ballad. It's a longer song-like poem. And even that contrasts to the literary ballad, which is a lengthy story-like poem that has kind of a question and answer format. It proposes questions to the reader, and then it actually answers those questions within the poem. And I always think of the Misty Mountain poem, song that the dwarves sing in The Hobbit, because it's talking about their history and also explaining, who they are and why they've come to Bilbo's house. And it's more of a ballad, but it has kind of a literary quality to it. So, like I said, these are just terms on these pages to know so that you can explain yourself when you're analyzing poems for your paper, but these are the kind of the ones I wanted to touch base on because they're the more prevalent terms that I think you guys will encounter. And then chapter 19 is about persona. And we talked about persona in our fiction presentation, which is, I feel like Dora the Explorer saying that. What's persona? But persona is a mask. You're hiding your true self. And in a poem, persona is actually more of a point of view. Persona is the voice speaking to you in the poem. So it kind of takes on a narrator quality in poetry. It's not just a mask like it is in fiction. Confessional poetry is similar to confessional fiction. It's very highly personal. It's almost secretive, and it usually is in a very intimate one-on-one tone. So I chose the example to show you all on page 853, which is by the very famous and highly contested poet Sappho. If you've never heard of Sappho before, some people say she's not real. Some people say that Socrates made her up and that she's not real, but I think she's real. But Sappho apparently was a colleague of Socrates. She's one of the very few women poets in ancient Greece that we still have poetry from. Her work is very hard to find, and there's only, I think, 11 to 20 pieces of poetry from her that they've ever found. But it's very interesting. She writes a lot about relationships, very romantic stuff, and her style of writing is very different from Socrates, so I have a hard time believing that she's actually him under a pseudonym. But she's one of the earliest published women writers, so I think it's interesting. But you can kind of see in her poem, A Letter to Anactoria, she kind of writes this sort of confession about this person that she has an interest in, a crush on. And it's very intimate and kind of confessional, like she's confiding in us, the reader, this secret about this person that she's interested in. And so that's why I wanted to bring that out as an example. But our book also talks about the persona of a poem and what it can do. And the idea behind persona is that it can share real life experience of a person's feelings. It can present a guarded or edited version of the subject of a poem. So it could be an altered retelling by the individual. It can adopt the stance of a detached observer, so it kind of observes like a fly on the wall scenario. Or it could even be an imaginary character that's very different from the poet. So Dr. Seuss, for example, has wrote tons and tons of kid stories with all these crazy characters in them, and I'm not sure that any of them are necessarily Dr. Seuss. They're all a persona. They're all kind of a mask that takes on different characteristics based on what he needs that character to do. So these are just what persona can be in a poem, but mainly in poetry, persona is more of like the point of view or narrator aspect than it is in fiction. Chapter 20 talks about tone, which we've touched on in the last chapter just a little bit. It is definitely the attitude created through words in a poem. And the tone chapter starts on page 872. Understatement is, like we've talked about in fiction, when the poet plays down personal feelings to create a stronger impact. And I love Dylan Thomas's Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, which is on page 880. And I do want to read this poem to you all because I love it. It's fabulous. But on page 880, do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in the green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight, and learned too late they grieved in its own way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Brave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. So there's a lot of repetition there, but that whole phrase, rage, rage against the dying of the light, there's never an exclamation point. There's punctuation throughout this entire poem, so it's clear that Thomas knows whether or not he's screaming this poem or he's just saying it. And the idea that when we think of the word rage, we think of all these like passionate and fierce and aggressive emotions, but just in that simple repetition, rage, rage against the dying of the light, it's very quiet and it's very understated. Like you can tell all the feelings are there, but when you read it, you don't ever feel like, at least I don't ever feel like I'm screaming or yelling this poem. It's all just kind of a quiet build. And I really like it for that. It's a great poem. I love it. But that's understatement. And then the rest of this chapter talks about these other terms. Elegies are poems of mourning. Often you think of an obituary or a eulogy. This would be the poetic version of that. A parable is a brief story with a weighty meaning. And our textbook is obsessed with Icarus. Icarus is a pretty famous, Greek story, but it's interesting that the book chooses to use Icarus so much as a comparison. If you're not familiar with the story of Icarus, Icarus is all about a father and son, and they created this set of wings made of wax, and Icarus decided that he would fly to the sun using these wings, and his father warns him. He's like, don't get too proud, don't be too egotistical, think about things before you rush into them. And Icarus is very stubborn. He's like, no, I know what I'm doing. And so he flies higher and higher to the sun, and eventually the sun melts his wings, and Icarus falls into the ocean and drowns. It's a real upbeat story, but that's kind of the parable, is this brief story, but has a big meaning, which is basically, don't be too proud, be humble, don't, try to overstep your boundaries. But there's a lot of parables out there that have big, deep meanings wrapped up in these very simplistic stories. Irony, again, our textbook decides to give us another definition for irony. I think it just can't make up its mind. Our textbook for poetry defines irony as a wry, humorous effect by bringing out truth we prefer to hide. And I don't like that definition, but that is what they've given us for poetry. And then paradox is an apparent contradiction that makes sense on the second thought. So it's one of those kind of too little, too late scenarios. Usually by the time you figure something out, it's already, past, or you've already, passed judgment on it. That would be a paradox. Chapter 21 does not have a lot of terms in it. It's just talking about theme, which is the purpose of the poem. And again, that can be super complex or very simple. The main things that the chapter talks about are to look for abstractions, which in this case are large areas of human experience. A lot of poems are about significant moments in people's lives. Not to say all poems are like that, because some poems are about very, small, minuscule moments, but a lot of them are about the big things that happen to us. First loves, moving on in life, death, birth. Things that are huge parts of the human experience are usually the subject for poems, and those are abstractions. A didactic is where you're teaching already accepted ideas or truths. So if you're teaching, like we talked about earlier, the idea of the story of Icarus and that don't be proud or be humble, those are very didactic teachings. They're things that have kind of been drilled into our heads since we were kids. So if you see a poem that's trying to represent that message, it would be didactic. And then finally, a caricature is just a comic distortion or exaggeration. And poetry is known for using lots of exaggeration and metaphors and symbolism. So you'll probably see caricature in some of your examples you guys look at for your assignments. And then finally, chapter 22 is myth and illusion. Myth comes from the Greek word mythos, which means tales, and they're typically stories about gods, godlike heroes, and monstrous adversaries. That's how our book defines them. I always think they talk about ancient stories or parables or people that are in those stories, like Hercules or Cinderella, things like that. I know Cinderella's not Greek, but it's kind of like a more traditional, looked over type of character, which we'll talk about in a second with archetypes. Rituals are not the rituals we think of. When I think of rituals, I think of that scene in Finding Nemo where they're like, shark bait, hoo ha ha, and they're trying to induct Nemo into their club. That's not what rituals are here. Here in poetry, rituals are actually events acted out by the heroes. So the trials of Hercules are rituals. Or if a character goes on a certain quest or a journey to prove themselves, that would be a ritual. Archetypes, similarly, are generalized, often stereotyped types of characters that we see throughout poems. And we see this happen with fiction and drama too, but our poetry chapter here talks about them. So for example, the hero, when I say he's the hero of the story, we kind of have an idea of what that hero looks like. Or if I say, oh, he's a superhero, you're like, oh, he kind of looks like Superman and has the muscles and all that. The damsel in distress, we think of Daphne off of Scooby-Doo or a princess in a tower. And then the monstrous villain, you think of maybe the monster in The Tempest by Shakespeare or perhaps Frankenstein. And a lot of modern poetry and modern stories have kind of taken archetypes and flipped them on their heads, because we as audiences have read about them so many times, we want something fresh. So, for example, the hero in Megamind is the villain. He's not this, super muscular, stoic type. He's not like that at all. In Shrek, the damsel in distress is very capable of taking care of herself and is not dainty or fragile. So that kind of trumps that trope. And then the monstrous villain, depending on, if you look at the movie Wonder Woman, the monstrous villain of Ares was this thin British guy. So, archetypes are important because they're kind of representations of how we view characters and sort of how we view traits that we see in ourselves. So when we see ourselves as heroic, we picture a certain side of ourselves. But I also like that modern poetry has embraced the sort of denouncing and flipping of these archetypes so that it kind of changes our perception and makes us think more about the poems themselves. So I do like that. Also in this chapter, not only myth, but also the term illusion. Illusion is not illusion. They're two different things. An allusion with an A is a mention that calls up a whole nother story and leads to a flashback. So if the author or poet is talking about an allusion, they may say, oh, well, the morning dew reminds me of the summer of 1983, and then they go on in their poem and talk about that. That whole morning dew would be an allusion because it's making the author think back on something that's already happened. An ode, whenever somebody says, an ode to my breakfast, or an ode to my friend, it's a solemn, elaborate poem that's kind of like a tribute to that subject matter. So an ode is very similar to a tribute. Metamorphosis, that term's thrown in there. It's a Greek term, means transformation. I feel like we encounter that term a lot. And then our last set of glossy pages are on page 954. And these glossy pages are very interesting. They're very different and odd. The poems match up in weird ways. And so I do want you to look over those poems and pictures and kind of see and think to yourselves, do they match, or are those kind of, it was an odd choice for a poem and image combo. But definitely look at those. And then the rest of the chapter really loves that tale of Icarus. There's lots of different perspectives about it. There's certain analyses of poems about Icarus, and it's an interesting section if you guys look at it before moving on. So the only extra thing I'll add is that even though we're not going to talk about chapter 23, which looks into Dickinson, Frost, and Brooks, which if you are interested in any of those poets, definitely give that chapter a look in our book, but you don't have to. They do bring up the term canon, and we didn't talk about canon with fiction, but it's something that will be important for you to know for the future, specifically with our last paper in this class. Canon means the accepted story. So, for example, if something is canon, it is accepted as truth in the story. So, for example, Disney's Descendants. I have young cousins, and they watch that show, and I don't like it because I don't think it's canon. If you don't know what Disney's Descendants are, if you've ever watched a Disney movie, you probably know about the villains: Ursula, Cruella de Vil, Jafar, Scar, the villains of the Disney movies. Well, Descendants is a show about their kids, but their kids all live in the same world and go to school together, and it's weird, and it doesn't make sense with the individual Disney stories. So I don't consider it canon because I don't think it fits. Now, my cousins don't care. They just watch it because it has teenagers and bright colors. But that's what canon is. It's the accepted story and the universe that is kind of contained within it. And when we talk about our final paper, I'm going to bring that term back up again, so I want to kind of go ahead and explain it now. But the terminology is on page 967 for that. So that's poetry. Again, we've got a lot of assignments with this unit. We have a lot of discussion forum assignments where you guys will kind of look at poems in these chapters, but that's a terminology, so hopefully these presentations will help you in preparation for the poetry exam that you guys will take in week 5. So until we talk about drama, give me any questions you guys have, and otherwise I look forward to reading your discussion forum posts and talking to you then. Bye.